Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Community Conversations. Today's topic is Stress and Collective Trauma Series, Strategies for Healing, Empowerment, and Well-Being in Uncertain Times. To do a welcome, Dean Jason Lane.
Thank you, Jerry, and welcome everybody. We're thrilled to have all of you with us on this summer day to talk about a very important topic related to mental health. As Jerry mentioned, I'm Jason Lane, and I have the privilege of being the Dean of the School of Education here at the University at Albany. We were founded more than 175 years ago. It was New York's first teachers college, and ever since then we've had a commitment to really bringing together practitioners across the K-12 and higher education spectrums to think about issues related to education and mental health. And we're delighted that we have the presenters with us today to sort of our return presenters to kick off this really important series. Before we start, I just wanted to share a little bit of information about upcoming events that we have for this summer. Keep going the next one there, Jerry. This coming week, next week, we will kick off our teleteaching series, which is a partnership with the New York State Master Teachers, where some of the Master Teachers will be with us to introduce, to do an introduction on digital tools for both educators and parents. Those of you who have been with us for a period of time for these community conversations know that we've spent a significant amount of time thinking about and speaking to remote education and gearing that both toward the teachers who are in the schools as well as the teachers who are in the homes. And so we hope that many of you will be able to join us for that. In addition, we have launched a series of asynchronous micro courses where teachers can earn 5 CTLA credits. They cover a range of topics: homeschooling, one-on-one, remote teaching, transforming literacy, instruction, and technology. These are all asynchronous. Individuals, if you're interested in these, need to sign up no later than this Friday, June 19th. And again, you can do it on your own time and your own schedule. Another series we have this summer is on leading in times of change, which is a partnership we have undertaken with the Capital Region BOCES here around Albany, New York. And the session we have on July 8th will be pandemic preparedness for the health, wellness, and safety in schools, really focusing on the ways in which schools are preparing for reopening come the fall. And in this particular series, we will have upcoming events on July 15th and August 19th, again, focusing on stress and collective trauma. We're very excited about those upcoming series, and you'll be hearing more about those in the coming weeks. We are also launching our summer camps this year. We have longstanding summer camps with the Capital District Writing Project, our Young Writers Workshops, which will be taking place this year virtually for a range of grades from first grade through seniors in high school, dealing with all sorts of fun topics, from creating your own worlds to tackling that college essay. So a great opportunity for using some of the summertime virtually to pick up on what may have been lost during the shift to remote learning. But we're also launching a new set of summer camps this year with our Master Teachers. These are virtual STEM summer camps. They all will be done using Zoom. These are with New York State Master Teachers, and a range of great opportunities for students from 1 hour to 3 hour lessons, some 1 day, some 3 days, for students to again advance their learning in the STEM related field. So encourage you to check those out on Remote ED. But that brings us here to our topic today and the presenters that we have. And again, we know that mental health has been a major issue as we have collectively dealt with COVID-19 and now with the protests and all that they signify in our communities across the country. Both in terms of our own mental health, as many have dealt with new stressors and new anxieties, given the situation we're dealing with, and as well as having to provide care and support for others during this critical time. It's a topic that we have covered a number of times, and we're delighted to have back our panelists today who will be with us throughout this series. Dr. Alex Peterson, who is an associate professor and the training director in the Department of Counseling Psychology here in the School of Education. He is also our Director of Equity and Inclusion. and Dr. Alana Gordis, who is an associate professor and area head and director of clinical training and psychology in our College of Arts and Sciences. So Alex and Alana, thank you so much for being here once again, and we look forward to the presentation. I'll turn it over to you.
Jason, thanks so much for the welcome. It's good to be back with everybody. We're going to jump right in and start out with take a pause and just do a collective assessment of our current stress level. So we are sharing with you a measure that is a well-known measure in the social sciences, the perceived stress scale. And we want to use this scale to kind of try to get a collective a sense of where we are in regard to our stress levels. I'm going to go through the items, share with you the way that you can score the items, and then we're going to try to use the poll feature, I think. I might need help with that feature to just get a sense of where folk are in regard to your stress level. So let's do this. There are four items. The scoring profile is listed immediately under the item. And I guess the easiest would be just to choose the appropriate number that matches your response. So number one, in the last month, how often have you felt that you were unable to control the important things in your life? Okay, number two, in the last month, how often, oh, I've just lost my slide. Here we go. Something happened. In the last month, how often have you felt confident about your ability to handle your personal problems? Number three, in the last month, how often have you felt that things were going your way? And number four, in the last month, how often have you felt difficulties were piling up so high that you could not overcome them? Okay. So those are the four stress-related items. Let's go to the next slide and we can see how we score these items, and then we can do our poll. Okay, so the scoring is pretty straightforward. All you do is sum up the responses on the four items. There are four items. The scoring range is from 0. Oh, sorry, that should be 0 to 16. I think I might have made a mistake there. And then higher scores indicate greater levels of stress. So if we can take a minute to complete our scores, and then if someone could help me with the polling feature. Ilana, I'm not sure how the polling feature works. I know we did this last time.
I think Penny did that. I think the poll was done.
Poll is live right now. There has been 24 responses so far, so 70%. I'm going to give some more time for people to complete the poll.
Okay, do you think the poll can be revealed, Penny?
It's at 76% at the moment, so I could end the polling and provide the results and share it. But I think some people just completed some more. So let me just end. It's 82% right now. Maybe just give like 30 more seconds and then I'll end it.
So for those social scientists in the audience, you know, anytime you're getting an 80% response rate, you are quite ecstatic.
Okay, all right, so I will end it and share results. Okay.
Okay, so if we can have a look at the poll here, we are seeing that 36% are scoring at 10, 21%, is that right? Are scoring at 6. I'm not sure if I'm reading this correctly, Ilana.
The percentage applies to the question. So 36% is scoring at the 2 for question number 1.
Okay, I'm with you. I'm with you. So if I'm reading this correctly, it would seem to suggest that the scoring is slanted to the higher level of stress. And it would suggest that we are all collectively experiencing a fairly high level of stress, if I'm interpreting that correctly. And so that's just providing the context for what we are talking about this afternoon. The next slide, thanks. So Ilana and I, a few weeks ago, shared some time with you where we did some initial thoughts around stress, trauma. We shared some suggestions for ways to manage stress. And so out of that time came the idea of perhaps doing a series over the summer months to dive in a little deeper. So we have a 3-event series, June, July, August. And what we want to do is essentially collectively think about how the current context is impacting us at the level of stress and trauma. We want to move from the individual to the group level. And then we want to talk about, for those of us in the helping professions broadly defined, we want to talk about strategies to assist others. So the first idea is that we are currently in this kind of collective state where we are exposed to 2 significant traumas as a society. The first trauma clearly is the COVID-19 pandemic. And more recently, the second societal level stressor that's come to fore is the impact of systemic racism that has been seen both in regard to COVID, but more recently in really the shocking pictures that came out of Minneapolis with the killing of Miss George Floyd, and then the subsequent general attention to systemic racism in our society. And the idea is that while we are collectively exposed to these stresses, based on our individual or our group histories, the way these stresses are impacting us might be different or might differentiate. And that's something we want to consider as well as we spend some time talking together. Okay. So I'm coming into this discussion with varying roles. As an educator, as a therapist, as a parent, as a spouse. And just within the past 48 hours, I received a very unfortunate reminder that while our focus is on these collective social level stresses that we are facing, we also as individuals and families are dealing with the kind of day-to-day stress that was here way before COVID. I received a message from my mother indicating that my father has some health concerns which need some attention. And so it was just a reminder that while we are focused on these kind of large social level stresses, also are dealing with very individual, personal stresses. It's useful for us to keep all of that in mind as we go through our discussion. So we would like to, and when I say we, Alana and I would like to present a framework for understanding the impact of current stresses. We're going to talk about individual and group level strategies for distress reduction and group level empowerment. And then, as I said, we want to talk about our role as helpers, educators, healthcare professionals, etc. Thanks, Penny. So the next slide allows us to take a second and just think of the sources of stress and trauma. We covered some of this when we first met a few weeks ago, but I'd like to draw your attention to the final bullet, which is other. So while I'm just listing and highlighting a few of these bullets, let me invite folk through the chat function just to identify, if you feel comfortable, just to identify other sources of stress and trauma that you think you might be experiencing, or as a collective society, we are all faced at the present moment. So again, we are thinking about this from the perspective of both COVID-19 and systemic racism, and clearly the overlap between those two. So we've identified, in regards to COVID-19, fear of illness, fear for our families, given the economic impact of the pandemic, loss of economic stability, housing, employment. Again, with the shelter in place that we are slowly coming out of, but still being impacted by, the balancing of parenting at home, working at home, schooling at home, trying to negotiate those different roles. In regard to COVID-19 and more obvious systemic racism, the idea of loss of safety for both individual, but also for groups that we are connected to, witnessing of bias, hate crimes, even as we are speaking. I believe down in Atlanta, there's a news conference that's focused on how the county there will proceed with the latest evidence of police brutality. So witnessing systemic violence, the impact of witnessing police brutality, witnessing the rioting that's been taking place, and the idea of uncertainty in social relationships, loss of social support, given the need to shelter in place. So I'm wondering if we could go to the chat, and if people feel comfortable just sharing any other types of stresses or sources of stress that perhaps we haven't listed in this list. Budget cuts because of less funding, stress related to wanting to do more to help, ailing parents and difficulty being present, wondering if we're reaching all our students, significant worries about the election, constant hypervigilance, being on guard, on lookout, trying to maintain safety. Fear of illness because of diabetes, and in the context of COVID, some of the comorbidities, family members being forced back to work, social distancing and the impact on mental health services, isolation. So even, just as fear for children living in a state with rising COVID numbers. Okay. For me, stress associated with bringing up 3 Black boys in a very racialized society. So even as we just sit with these stresses, we can almost feel some of the weight, the heaviness that's associated with what we are dealing with, both as individuals and as a collective society. Thanks for sharing those. The next slide, please. So the critical context associated with what we're also dealing with is this notion of uncertainty. Uncertainty with the pandemic. As a training director, I'm getting tired saying to our students, well, we think this is going to happen next year, but we're not sure. So there's uncertainty, and that translates in all aspects of our life. And I think from the mental health perspective, it's most really fair to say that uncertainty is kind of a breeding ground for anxiety. It's a perfect fuel for the experience of anxiety. So what are some potential impacts of uncertainty? Just waiting for the next slide. While we're waiting, someone added restlessness as a type of stress we're currently experiencing. So uncertainty and stress, okay? The notion of anxiety, I don't know what will happen. Sometimes we end up engaging in catastrophic thinking because we don't know. We imagine the worst case outcome. Indecision, sometimes paralyzing indecision, not knowing how to move forward. If you were to speak to my family members, you might hear them endorse irritability, a sense of fear, feeling powerless, and then this idea of what's the point, a kind of existential questioning. Okay? And Ilana later on is going to share with us some a kind of practical and pragmatic way to kind of deal with some of the physiological impacts of some of this uncertainty and stress. The next slide, thanks. So we want to make a distinction between stress and trauma. And I also at this point want to just remind you that we are sharing a space to discuss some aspects of mental health in regard to stress. We are not providing an intervention, nor are we providing diagnoses. But I think it's useful to make some distinction between traumatic stress and stress. So the idea of traumatic stress is that the spectrum of stress that really lends itself more to illness, psychopathology. And the notion is that traumatic stress refers to a more intense stress reaction that is associated with, with a specific stressor. So you think of some of the stress and trauma sources that we listed before, and we think of reactions to those that tend to be a little more severe. And if you are thinking about diagnoses, the idea is that really the severity, the duration, and the disruptive nature of the stress is what informs the diagnosis. Okay? So common experiences associated with traumatic stress are these intrusive thoughts, memories, behaviors that are associated with avoiding those intrusive re-experiencing experiences, and negative alterations in mood or cognition, fear, self-blame, and then changes in arousal and reactivity, which is the piece that Ilana is going to walk us through in a few minutes. It's also, I think, important just to remind ourselves that stress affects our behavior and our relationships. So I think one example of this is social media. And yeah, I must confess that I'm actually not in social media, but I live with people who are on social media, and a lot of people talk to me about social media. And it seems that there's an increased reactivity currently, just in general society, and certainly portrayed on social media. So an increased reactivity, potential increase in conflict, family, kids with social relationships, a sense of being less empathic or compassionate, perhaps feeling unmotivated. And so these are some ways possibly in which stress might impact our behavior and also impact our relationships. The next slide, thanks. So we are sharing some suggestions for managing uncertainty. The idea of being gentle, being kind to ourselves and others, lowering what we expect of ourselves and others, prioritizing our general health. Certainly in this time of misinformation, it's important to, I think, be aware of trying to access reliable, accurate sources of information. and then perhaps just acknowledging the difficulty of the situation. So those are just kind of brief tips. And what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Ilana, who's going to walk us through a more kind of specific stress reduction strategy that might be beneficial. Thanks, Solana.
Thanks, Alex. As I sit here and I knew that my turn was coming to talk, I just noticed my own physiological experience. My heart rate increased a little bit. My palms are a little bit sweaty. And that is actually part of the kind of physiological reactions that we deal with when we're experiencing stress. It also is the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight response, also engages when we're interested and excited. So I'm going to call it that, my experience right now. But when we're faced with stress, we have physiological systems that engage, and these actually are important for helping us engage, defend ourselves, deal with whatever stressors coming, you have energy to address what we need to do. And these are two key branches of the stress response. The sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight response. Heart rate increases, respiration rate increases, palms become sweaty, pupils dilate. This is really important because when our sympathetic nervous systems are activated, we tend to be less compassionate, empathic. We are not usually it's great when we're being chased by lions to be able to fight back or run away. But when we're trying to get our kids to do their laundry or have a discussion with our spouse about whose turn it is to do the dishes, those reactions don't tend to make us as productive in those conversations. The other branch I just want to mention now, the other cascade of events that happens during stress is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is a cascade of events that leads to the secretion of cortisol from the adrenal glands. And this is also important for helping us engage with stressors, but ideally when stress passes, cortisol returns to its baseline levels. And when we're faced with chronic stress, this can lead to real problems in the regulation of the system because high levels of cortisol circulating through the system over long periods of time create wear and tear. They damage certain cells in the physiology, including the hippocampus. And so there are reasons that we really want to manage stress that can help with our overall health as well. And there's a lot of plasticity in the system from what we know. And so instead of being stressed about the HPA axis, we can say we can do stuff to stay healthy and manage stress. So there's really good benefits both physiologically and interpersonally for managing stress. Could I have the next slide, please? So there are strategies that we use. They're part of behavior therapy or other kinds of psychotherapy, but also just in different cultural experiences that help us calm that fight or flight response. And so today we're going to talk about definitely one, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about two of these in more detail. But the four really good strategies that I would encourage people to investigate, and there's some resources at the end of this presentation that have some places to go to look for guidance on these, further guidance: paced breathing, meditation, mindfulness, and relaxation strategies. So we're going to talk more about paced breathing and other relaxation strategies. But go back one second. I'm not going to get to that slide yet. Thank you. I just want to stay right here. Mindfulness there's a lot of different meditation practices, and that can really help with overall well-being. And I have some resources listed at the end of the presentation on places to go for free guided meditations. It's a practice that takes work. It needs to be cultivated and developed, but it can be very beneficial. And mindfulness is just, there are also mindfulness strategies that you can find at the end of this presentation. And the idea here is to really focus on what is happening right here, right now, with an open, curious, non-judgmental sense. And there are some guided mindfulness protocols that can really help with this. And so maybe also during the series, we can come back to some of these. What I want to do right now, before we move into the paced breathing exercises, first, I just want everyone to rate their own stress level right now on a scale from 1 being totally relaxed, I feel great, to 10, I feel more stressed than I could even imagine. I'm like super stressed out. So just write down a number of what your stress level is from 1 to 10. So 5 is kind of in the middle, 10 is super stressed, 1 is super calm. And just write down that number. And now, without changing anything, what I'm going to do, and I did this in the last presentation, but we're going to take this a little bit further this time. I'm going to time 30 seconds, and I just want you to count the number of breaths you take. So in inspiration and expiration, so breathe in and breathe out counts as 1 breath. Don't try to slow it down yet. Just breathe how you've been breathing as much as possible. And I'm going to say start, and you can start counting. And when I say stop, you can stop and just write down that number. Okay, go. Okay, stop. So that, however many breaths you took was your 30-second breaths per minute. So multiply that by 2 to get your breaths per minute, right? So, because that was half a minute. I was not very clear when I expressed that. Multiply the number you just got by 2, so you get your breaths per minute. Now, next slide, please. I was about to do that on my computer, which wouldn't have worked. So in paced breathing, what we want to do is slow the breathing rate down. People can feel free to share what their total number of breaths per minute was, but you don't have to. It's just very optional, because I know it might be personal. But we know that if we slow our breathing rate down, like 10 to 12 breaths per minute is around average, but if we can slow our breaths per minute down even further, it seems to have a really beneficial effect on our stress level. So while we're spending the next bit of time talking about this, what I'd like you to do is try to slow your breathing rate down to even 6, or like 8, 6, if you can even do 5 breaths per minute. And there's some, I see people are saying 14, 16, 12. So those are, you're not like, you probably noticed that you're not like hyperventilating, like, but you are breathing at a faster rate than is optimal for decreasing your sympathetic nervous system activity and increasing your parasympathetic nervous system activity, which is what I'm going to talk about in a second. So we're going to try to work on slowing our breathing rate down. And how do you do that? There are different ways to do it. If you think about wanting to get your breathing rate down to like 6 breaths per minute, then if you are counting 10 seconds for an inspiration and expiration, which means you could count 5 counts in, 5 counts out, you're going to slow it down. So you can do it by counting. I personally don't like counting my breathing because it makes me a little more stressed, although I'm trying to practice that. You can also just work on trying to slow it down and breathe through your nose instead of your mouth. That's a really natural way to do it. But whatever seems natural, but a way to slow it down. You can also focus on like thinking about your diaphragm, like diaphragmatic breathing, like expanding so that your abdominal cavity expands as you take breath in instead of just breathing from your chest. So I'm going to keep talking, but I'll start the timer just to do this for 2 minutes and see what happens if you can work on slowing down your rate of breathing. Trying to get it down. So you can also, I promise not to put anything too interesting up. You could shut your eyes, make sure you're really comfortable. Just slow everything down. Breathe through your nose. Count. You can count 5, count to 6 on the way in. Count on the way out. Take your time. Get really comfortable. See if you notice yourself starting to relax a little bit. And if we could have the next slide, and this will stay up so you can, if your eyes are closed, that's okay, but I'll kind of talk you through it. So there's different ideas about how paced breathing works, but one idea is based on the fact that the autonomic nervous system has two branches that respond to stress. So one is that fight or flight response that I mentioned, the sympathetic nervous system. And the other is its kind of complement. It's called the parasympathetic nervous system. And we call that one the rest and digest response. And ideally, for a coordinated response to stress, when you're faced with stress, your sympathetic nervous system engages and your parasympathetic nervous system withdraws. Now, that doesn't always happen. And one thing we look at in my research lab is what the consequences of when those things are not in coordination, those two branches. But what we're hoping to do with paced breathing is engage the PNS over the SNS. And so this is just an example of some research looking at the effects of different paces of breathing on the relative strength of the PNS, well, on the power of the PNS. And these folks, okay, we're done with our 2 minutes, so I'll keep talking, but give yourself another rating now. See how if you're going to use that same rating scale from 1 to 10, what's your subjective experience of stress right now, having spent a couple minutes doing some paced breathing? So feel free to share that or just note for yourself. What's interesting, these folks found that if you can do 4 breaths per minute, that was the most favorable for having the parasympathetic nervous system be engaged. It's really, I really like this. Imagine the numbers being puffy and pastel and inflating as you slowly progress through them. That's a great suggestion. Imagery can really help with this. Thank you, Mary. That's lovely. They found that 4 breaths per minute was really good for engaging the parasympathetic. They tried all different breaths per minute, but 3 was not. So apparently you don't want to go lower than 4. That's pretty slow, but slowing down your breathing can really help. Interestingly, whereas when we're feeling really intense fight or flight response, we tend to be less affiliative and kind and compassionate. Conversely, there's a lot of research looking at how parasympathetic nervous system activity relates to behavior, and it seems very important for emotion regulation. So it makes sense that we want to engage the PNS when we're trying to manage our stress. Next slide, please. Okay, so just highlighting these other strategies. Maybe we could do this. Alex, do you think should I do a little bit of PMR, or do you think we're too tight for time?
We might be tight, especially if we want to open up some observations or questions.
Yeah, so maybe we can put that in for next time. We'll do a little bit of progressive muscle relaxation, which is really about tensing and relaxing muscle groups one at a time. But it's also really, it's a technique that we've used in behavior therapy for many years, and it has a lot of benefits for mood, for stress, for pain, for sleep. So it's a really great strategy. And there's some resources at the end, but maybe we'll come back to it and revisit it again. Let's see. And actually, I put up this reference because it was actually research done here at UAlbany by my colleague Sharon Danoffberg and her colleague. She's no longer at UAlbany, but they looked at the effects of PMR and mindfulness, and they both improved mood and reduced anxiety, but through different paths. So it's nice to highlight research that we're doing right in the psychology department. Next slide, please. So just why is it so important for us to consider managing our own stress level? I think, Alex and I talked about starting at the individual level, and then as we move through the series, thinking more about collective empowerment, action, and well-being. And I think it's very hard to contribute in a constructive way to causes when we ourselves are not able to be at our best. And if you think about times when you're most stressed out and your behavior during those times, probably it's not your best behavior when you're feeling super stressed. And so by managing our own stress levels, and these are simple things that we can do, even though that doesn't change the world, and the world does need to be changed, it really will empower us to make a good contribution. So that's why we felt like it was a good place to start. On an interpersonal level, it's really important because social support is a huge protective factor against the negative effects of stress. So when you look at the trauma literature, what kinds of things protect people from developing PTSD in the face of a trauma? Social support is huge. It emerges over and over again in the literature. My students in my lab just did a study. Well, we're still analyzing the data, but they found that social support mediates the effects of COVID impact on parenting stress, on anxiety, depression. So our ability to receive social support, and I think giving and receiving social support are quite reciprocal, really affects our well-being. So all these things are connected. So to the extent that we can manage our own stress levels and engage in a more constructive, compassionate way with others, we're also going to be able to experience more social support. So it's going to, in an iterative way, help us function better. And ideally, that will also help us help the world more too. So I think that's a really important reason to start with our own stress management. The put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your children metaphor is something that seems to come up a lot in my conversations with people. So I think the next slide, I think Alex, the next slide is yours.
Oh, we've got one final just comment before we open up to some questions and observations. Of course, as psychologists, you would judge us harshly if we didn't attend to emotions. So we're going to take a second just to remind you that clearly the affective, emotional aspect of stress is really critical to be thoughtful about. And we have some do's and don'ts. Typically as a practitioner, I tend not to be prescriptive, but right now I am being prescriptive around do's and don'ts in regard to attending to your emotions. So we want you to think about the idea of honoring and respecting your emotions and not repressing. We want you to acknowledge your emotions, not avoid. We would invite you to be attentive, not to dismiss, to accept your feelings, not to judge your feelings. And then with folk who you feel comfortable and trusting to share your emotions and not hide. And just asking you to think about your emotional life as another important aspect of stress management. So with those comments, we have about, I think, 10 to 12 minutes. We'd like to open up the space, possibly for questions if there are any. We're also very interested in strategies that people might want to share with us that's working for you in regard to managing stress in general, but particularly the current stresses around systemic racism, COVID-19. So we have about 10 to 12 minutes just to open up the space.
Alex, one of the things that when you were mentioning the news you got and the stress of that, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on is that in the context of major stressors that are going on, life is also going on. And that the kind of overlay of things that are being missed out on, or just the things that are unrelated to the major events that are going on in the world that are still stressful that we experience, have to be dealt with. And they seem even more difficult and more taxing, somewhat because of the logistics of it, maybe more difficult, but also just the mental energy that's required is, you know, it's easy to forget that everything is harder, it seems. So.
Okay. And so we might have less resources even to manage those typical stresses.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that like you and I have talked about in terms of what makes sense to include in our, like what we share, is that the need for intentionality, because our resources are so taxed, and we don't even necessarily notice it in the ways that fish don't notice that they're swimming in water, right? Like it's almost like we have to focus on the things that we need to do just to be able to manage in a way that we might not otherwise. Looks like there's a question.
So we have a question from Deborah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
hi.
I think you
Hi.
raised your hand.
Thank you very much. Should I put myself on or?
Yeah.
How to do that? Hi. Thank you. This is really helpful to consider. Also, because I came to this because I knew there was discussion of collective trauma and systemic racism. And I know this isn't an intervention, but I'm just trying to hear from you both, perhaps, like what are some ways of actually discussing systemic racism, or many people don't even have a concept or don't want to believe that that's even true. And the reactions that come about, for example, at cost-cutting times, I was in a position of being attacked, kind of, in my view, for how cuts are being around the most diverse and inclusive resources, for example, that invite that. And no one else thought that there was anything strange about that. And I couldn't call that, I'm not trying to call anybody names, but I did say that it appears to target that kind of research or that kind of inquiry, and people just reacted so strongly. So like I said, I know it's not an intervention, but I think there's some assumption that everybody understands systemic racism, and I'm wondering if that's your experience, because it hasn't been mine, but I don't know how to enter that or create a better space for dialogue when I sense that that's not an accepted or a term that anyone understands. It's very stressful when the group is basically saying, no, we just based it on how many people, we just cut this resource based on how many people used it.
Deborah, if I'm hearing you correctly, part of what you're talking about is that there is a certain amount of stress associated with not acknowledging the systemic oppression in our society. Mm-hmm. And then also stress associated when you are trying to bring attention to it and you get some pushback. Mm-hmm. And so again, part of what I would share is that I think when we are dealing with systems of oppression, because these are so entrenched, it's difficult to push back on your own. And so to find folk who are willing to do the work with you is critical. And then also to be able to be really intentional around when you want to be in teaching mode and when you need to kind of be more in I need support mode. So really to be very intentional around what you need and the capacity that you have at any given point in time to really engage, the pushing back, because when you push back, you will be pushed back. That's the way systemic oppression works. So that's, a couple of thoughts just in response to your question, which is a really important question.
Thank you. Very important response. Thanks.
Any other thoughts or questions or even possibly suggestions for how we can all kind of navigate this process together? We have a suggestion from Deborah Gordis. Please share.
And thank you, other Deborah, for what you shared. It very much resonated with me, and it's very hard, especially for us aging activists who are, stuck at home and not able to join the protests, because of trauma. One of the things that I recommend to my clients who have experienced trauma, and I think probably all of us are right now, is to also use physical activity to discharge a lot of the, painful, distressing energy that can build up. For some people with, unintegrated trauma, and I think that's a lot of us right now, the mindfulness activities or meditation or breathing, and I use 3-6 breathing with my clients, can be really challenging. So I've recommended even dancing around your living room, taking walks. Walking is bilateral stimulation of the brain, which can be really calming. But, sort of using activities that bring you physical joy, even in the middle of, all this sadness and distress, it can be more effective for some people than meditation and mindfulness, depending on their trauma status. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very useful and helpful observation as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think physical activity is a great, also there's a lot of research on the benefits of that for stress and mood. So definitely there's a lot of different strategies. And I think the breathing and mindfulness and meditation are really challenging. And for some people, they are very stressful too, just in and of themselves.
Yeah, some very, very useful, helpful suggestions from Mary. Reaching out, serving in some way, baking for self and others. In my practice, some of my folk I work with are teaching me about the notion of gratitude, cultivating gratitude as you go through the day, or possibly looking for moments of joy.
And I would echo too the real benefit of doing things that help others. And I think that also links in well to the collective well-being that we're hopefully going to contribute to. And I think like it's challenging because we don't want to feel so stress-free that we're complacent with things that are unjust. And so I think that, like Alex, what you were saying too about finding ways to be intentional about when we act and when we take care of ourselves and not being alone. And because it is stressful to make change and protest and do things that are really important to do. So it's not necessarily the right answer to avoid all stress. And so how to do things in a way that will be healthy for ourselves and also healthy for the collective good. And I think it is really noteworthy that one of the really beneficial approaches to, for example, treat depression is doing things that bring you joy and doing things that help other people, right? Like it just tends to be uplifting.
So we unfortunately, we are rapidly coming to the end of our time. I wonder if we could just switch to the slide that has some resources. Shifted. Ilana, do you want to just highlight a couple of these that you had mentioned?
Yeah, I was just finding some places to go to get more information. These are not exhaustive, but there's some information on paced breathing. Oops, can we go back to that one slide? From the National Center for PTSD. There's some really great PMR resources, and hopefully we'll come back to this. There's a couple mindfulness links that have some really great, I guess I have a bias toward mindfulness in California. I don't know why that is, but I send people to these sites. There's apps. There's a PMR app, but it's really stilted, so I can't quite recommend it. But there's some that charge, so that's problematic. But I also want to highlight that we have our clinic, the UAlbany Psychological Services Center, where our students do therapy under our supervision. I'm there right now a lot doing supervision. That's a great resource. That's a low fee, a sliding scale fee, training clinic where people, so that's the information if people are interested in pursuing actual psychotherapy. And so that's a place where people can be referred for services. So we'll continue to maybe find more resources as time goes by, but those are just a start.
And when we reconvene in a month, we're going to shift to thinking more collectively, thinking more about the impact of trauma or stress at a group level. But perhaps, Ilana, as we start the next session in about a month, we can do a little bit of progressive muscle relaxation as a way to kick off the session.
Okay.
And put us in a more relaxed state.
Makes us more open to learning.
So thank you everyone for your contribution. I believe that the presentation will be available, hopefully with the chat comments. And so more information will be forthcoming about how to access the presentation. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
Be well.
Thank you everyone for joining Community Conversations this week. This information will be available on the remoteed.org website. And I want to thank our presenters, Dr. Gordis and Dr. Peterson, for their helpful information. I look forward to next month when you will continue the series. So thank you all, and we wish you well.
Thanks.
Thanks.